January 1945. A freezing headquarters in France. General George Patton sat across from Dwight Eisenhower and said something that shocked everyone in the room. If Montgomery got supreme command of Allied ground forces, Patton would resign. Not request a transfer. Not ask for a different assignment. Resign completely. Walk away from the war he had spent his entire life preparing to fight. Eisenhower stared at his most aggressive general, the man who had just saved the 101st Airborne at Bastogne, and realized this wasn't a bluff. Patton meant every word. What happened in the next 72 hours nearly tore apart the Allied command structure and changed how the final months of World War II would be fought. This is a story about ego, rivalry, and the impossible job of keeping Allied generals from destroying each other before they could destroy Germany. If you want more deep dives into the commanders who won and lost the war, hit subscribe. We're building something special here. What was at stake went far beyond personal pride. The alliance between America and Britain was fragile. Churchill desperately needed to show the British public that their generals still mattered after 4 years of American dominance. Eisenhower needed British cooperation to finish the war. And Patton, the most successful American field commander in Europe, was threatening to blow the whole thing apart. The decision Eisenhower made would either preserve the alliance or hand Montgomery exactly what he wanted at the cost of losing Patton forever. To understand why Patton was willing to throw away his career, you need to understand who these two men were and why they despised each other. Patton was not a typical general. While other commanders studied logistics tables and supply routes, Patton read ancient Greek military texts and wrote poetry about warriors who never died. He genuinely believed he had lived past lives as a soldier, fighting with Alexander the Great and Napoleon. War wasn't just his profession. It was his religion. His soldiers loved him because he led from jeeps at the front lines, not from comfortable headquarters miles behind the fighting. He wore ivory-handled pistols, designed his own uniform, and gave speeches that made men want to charge into enemy fire. Other generals thought he was insane. Eisenhower called him the best tank commander in the army and the worst diplomat who ever wore stars on his shoulders. Patton didn't care what people thought. He believed speed and aggression won wars, and everything he did proved it. Montgomery was Patton's complete opposite. Where Patton was fire, Montgomery was ice. He planned every operation down to the last detail, refusing to attack until he had overwhelming superiority in men and supplies. He commanded from headquarters far behind the lines, surrounded by staff officers who treated him like a field marshal should be treated. He didn't drink, didn't smoke, and went to bed at 9:30 every night no matter what was happening at the front. British newspapers loved him. He had won at El Alamein when Britain desperately needed a victory, and Churchill made sure everyone knew Montgomery had saved North Africa. The British press called him the greatest British general since Wellington. Montgomery believed it. He told Eisenhower repeatedly that American generals were amateurs who had gotten lucky with superior numbers. He wanted command of all Allied ground forces, British and American, and he thought he deserved it. The two men had clashed from the moment they first worked together in Sicily. Montgomery had lobbied to get the main invasion beaches, forcing Patton into a supporting role. Patton had responded by racing across Sicily so fast that he captured Palermo before Montgomery's careful advance had barely started. Montgomery fumed. Patton gloated. Eisenhower had to referee them like children fighting over toys. The rivalry only got worse in France. Montgomery's Operation Market Garden, his attempt to end the war with one bold stroke, had failed catastrophically in September 1944. Thousands of British paratroopers died or were captured at Arnhem. Meanwhile, Patton's Third Army was tearing across France, liberating towns faster than anyone could track. The contrast made Montgomery look cautious and Patton look brilliant. Then came December 1944 and the German counteroffensive that changed everything. The Battle of the Bulge caught almost everyone by surprise. German armies smashed through American positions in the Ardennes forest, creating a huge bulge in the Allied lines. Entire divisions were surrounded. The 101st Airborne was trapped in Bastogne. Panic spread through Supreme Headquarters. Bradley, who commanded all American ground forces, looked overwhelmed. Eisenhower needed someone to take control of the situation north of the German breakthrough. The logical choice was Montgomery. His British forces were nearby, he wasn't engaged in heavy fighting, and he had available reserves. On December 20th, Eisenhower gave Montgomery temporary command of all Allied forces north of the Bulge, including 2 American armies. Montgomery saw his chance. This was what he had been waiting for. American generals had failed. German forces had broken through American lines. Now a British field marshal would have to save them. Montgomery made sure everyone knew it. He arrived at American headquarters in a Rolls-Royce, accompanied by British officers who treated the Americans like incompetent colonials. He immediately began reorganizing American units, changing their dispositions, pulling them back to create what he called a more rational defensive line. American generals were furious. Montgomery acted like he was cleaning up a mess that American stupidity had created. But Montgomery did stabilize the northern sector. He organized defenses that stopped the German advance. He coordinated British and American units effectively. He prevented panic from spreading. When Patton broke through from the south to relieve Bastogne on December 26th, the combined pressure from north and south stopped the German offensive. By early January, the Bulge was being eliminated. The crisis was over. Germany had shot its last bolt and failed. Montgomery held a press conference on January 7, 1945. What he said in that room nearly destroyed the alliance. Montgomery stood before British and American reporters and described the Battle of the Bulge as if he personally had saved the American army. He talked about how the situation was very interesting when he arrived, implying chaos and confusion among the Americans. He described how he had brought British professionalism to bear on the problem. He made it sound like American forces had been on the verge of collapse until British leadership restored order. He barely mentioned Patton's relief of Bastogne. He didn't credit American units that had held critical positions against overwhelming odds. The subtext was clear. Americans couldn't handle a real crisis. They needed British generals to save them. American newspapers picked up the story immediately. Headlines screamed that Montgomery was claiming credit for American sacrifices. The American public was outraged. Soldiers who had fought in the Bulge felt insulted. Congressmen demanded that Eisenhower remove Montgomery from any command over American troops. Bradley told Eisenhower that he couldn't work with Montgomery anymore. Even George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff in Washington, sent a message saying the political situation was becoming impossible. Patton exploded. He had never liked Montgomery, but this was unforgivable. American soldiers had died by the thousands in the Bulge. The 101st Airborne had held Bastogne surrounded and outnumbered. Patton's Third Army had turned 90 degrees in winter and attacked in weather that most generals said made offensive operations impossible. And Montgomery was taking credit for all of it. Patton called Montgomery a tired little fart who tried to steal glory from men who actually fought. He told his staff that Montgomery was the most overrated general in military history. He wanted to challenge Montgomery publicly, to expose him as a cautious fraud who had never taken a real risk. Eisenhower tried to contain the damage. He sent a message to Montgomery explaining, as diplomatically as possible, that the press conference had caused serious problems. Montgomery responded with a letter that made things worse. He wrote to Eisenhower suggesting that the Bulge proved American forces needed better coordination and that a single ground force commander should control all Allied armies. That commander, Montgomery made clear, should be him. He argued that Eisenhower was spread too thin trying to command from Supreme Headquarters while also acting as ground force commander. What the Allied armies needed was someone at the front, directing operations, making decisions. Someone like Montgomery. Churchill saw the disaster developing. The Prime Minister understood politics better than Montgomery ever would. He knew that if Britain pushed too hard for Montgomery to get more power, the Americans would rebel. American soldiers outnumbered British soldiers in Europe by more than 3-1. American factories were supplying most of the weapons and equipment. American generals were not going to accept a British supreme commander, no matter how much Montgomery believed he deserved it. Churchill stood up in Parliament and gave a speech praising American soldiers and American generals. He specifically credited Patton's relief of Bastogne and Bradley's steady leadership. He called the Battle of the Bulge an American victory won by American courage. It was a political masterstroke, designed to calm American anger and remind Montgomery that Britain needed America more than America needed Britain. But Montgomery didn't get the message. He kept pushing. He sent another letter to Eisenhower in late January arguing his case for ground force command. He pointed out his experience, his victories in North Africa, his management of D-Day planning. He suggested, carefully but clearly, that American generals lacked the operational sophistication to command large formations in complex battles. He wanted Eisenhower to recommend to the combined chiefs of staff that command arrangements be changed before the final push into Germany. This letter reached Eisenhower on January 28. He read it twice, put it down, and asked his chief of staff to bring him the file on ground force command. The file contained previous letters from Montgomery on the same topic, notes from British military leaders supporting Montgomery, and something else. A message from George Patton. Patton's message was simple and absolute. If Montgomery received command of Allied ground forces, Patton would resign his commission and go home. He would not serve under Montgomery. He would not take orders from a man he considered a coward who hid behind overwhelming superiority and then claimed genius. He would not watch American soldiers die implementing Montgomery's cautious, slow, methodical strategies when aggressive action could end the war faster. Patton told Eisenhower that he had spent his entire life preparing for this war, but he would walk away before he would serve under Montgomery. Eisenhower sat in his office and faced the most difficult command decision since D-Day. On one side was Montgomery, backed by Churchill and the British government, arguing that he deserved supreme ground command and that the war effort required it. On the other side was Patton, the most effective American field commander, threatening to resign if it happened. Between them was Bradley, who commanded all American ground forces and who had also told Eisenhower privately that he would ask to be relieved if Montgomery got the job. The practical military argument favored keeping things as they were. Patton and Bradley worked well together. Bradley trusted Patton to execute aggressive operations while Montgomery handled more methodical advances. The command structure was functioning. Changing it would create chaos just as Allied armies prepared for the final assault into Germany. But the political argument favored Montgomery. Britain had been fighting since 1939. British cities had been bombed. British armies had fought in North Africa, Italy, and France. Churchill needed to show the British people that their generals still played a major role. Giving Montgomery ground force command would satisfy British pride and cement the alliance for the final months of war. Eisenhower called his chief of staff and dictated a response to Montgomery. The letter was diplomatic but firm. Eisenhower wrote that the current command arrangements were working effectively and that he saw no reason to change them. He praised Montgomery's leadership during the Bulge but made clear that the decision on command structure was Eisenhower's to make, not Montgomery's to demand. He reminded Montgomery that Allied cooperation required mutual respect and that public statements claiming credit for American sacrifices damaged that cooperation. The message was professional, but the meaning was clear. Montgomery was not getting ground force command. The conversation was over. Montgomery received this letter on January 30th. He immediately wrote back saying he must have been misunderstood, that he was only trying to help, that he fully supported Eisenhower's leadership. The backpedaling was obvious. Montgomery realized he had pushed too far and that Eisenhower had pushed back. He dropped his campaign for supreme command, at least publicly. Privately, he still believed he deserved it and that American generals were making mistakes he would have avoided. Patton never knew how close Montgomery had come to getting what he wanted. Eisenhower didn't tell him about Montgomery's letters or about the political pressure from London. He simply sent Patton a message saying the command structure would remain unchanged and that Patton should focus on his upcoming operations into Germany. Patton was satisfied. He had drawn his line, and Eisenhower had respected it. The threat of resignation had worked. But the cost was real. Eisenhower had been forced to choose between Allied unity and military effectiveness. He chose effectiveness, but it created lasting tension with the British. Montgomery felt humiliated. Churchill was disappointed that Britain's most famous general had been denied the recognition Churchill thought he deserved. The British press began criticizing Eisenhower more openly, questioning his strategic decisions and suggesting that American generals were extending the war through incompetence. The unified Allied command that had landed at Normandy was fracturing under the pressure of competing egos and national pride. The final months of the war proved Eisenhower right. Patton's Third Army raced across Germany faster than Montgomery's more careful advance. Patton crossed the Rhine before Montgomery's elaborately planned crossing operation even began. American armies reached the Elbe River and could have taken Berlin if Eisenhower had let them. Montgomery's cautious methods might have worked in North Africa where supply lines were thin and mistakes were costly, but in the final drive across Germany, speed mattered more than caution. Patton's aggressive style was exactly what the situation required. Montgomery never forgave Eisenhower for denying him supreme command. After the war, he wrote in his memoirs that American generals had prolonged the war through poor strategy and that if he had been given ground force command in January 1945, the war would have ended sooner with fewer casualties. Most military historians disagree. Montgomery's record in 1944 and 1945 showed a pattern of overcaution, elaborate planning that delayed operations, and a tendency to blame others when things went wrong. Market Garden, his boldest operation, had been a disaster. His careful advance after D-Day had been so slow that Patton had to break out at the other end of Normandy to save the campaign. Giving Montgomery command of all ground forces would likely have slowed the final advance and given Germany more time to organize defenses. Patton never got the recognition Montgomery craved. He made too many controversial statements, offended too many people, and died in a car accident in Germany in December 1945 before he could return home to parades and glory. But he died knowing that he had threatened to walk away from the war rather than serve under Montgomery, and that Eisenhower had backed him. For Patton, that validation mattered more than medals or promotions. It meant that Eisenhower understood what Patton had always believed. Aggressive commanders won wars. Cautious commanders extended them. The crisis in January 1945 revealed something fundamental about coalition warfare. Personalities matter as much as strategy. Egos can be as dangerous as enemy armies. A supreme commander's job isn't just planning operations and moving divisions. It's managing relationships between commanders who hate each other, balancing political pressure from allied governments, and making decisions that keep the coalition together even when logic suggests it should fall apart. Eisenhower succeeded where many would have failed because he understood that his primary mission wasn't defeating Germany. It was keeping Americans and British working together long enough to defeat Germany. Every decision he made served that larger purpose. So when Patton threatened to resign if Montgomery got supreme command, he was testing whether Eisenhower valued military effectiveness more than political convenience. The answer shaped the final 4 months of the war. Eisenhower chose the general who would win battles over the general who would win political points. He chose aggressive action over careful planning. He chose Patton over Montgomery. And Germany surrendered 4 months later with Allied armies deep inside German territory, advancing faster than German forces could retreat. After the war, a reporter asked Eisenhower if he had any regrets about command decisions in Europe. Eisenhower thought for a moment and said that managing Allied generals was harder than fighting Germans. The Germans were at least predictable. Allied generals all thought they were smarter than everyone else and all wanted glory for themselves. Keeping them focused on the mission instead of their own reputations had been the hardest part of his job. When asked specifically about Patton and Montgomery, Eisenhower smiled and said that putting those two in the same theater was like putting two roosters in the same henhouse. Eventually they were going to fight each other. His job was making sure they fought the Germans first. That's what made January 1945 so dangerous. For a few weeks, the Roosters stopped fighting Germans and started fighting each other. Patton threatened to quit. Montgomery demanded promotion. Bradley threatened to ask for relief. The carefully constructed Allied command structure nearly collapsed under the weight of competing egos and national pride. Eisenhower held it together, but just barely. And he did it by choosing military effectiveness over political convenience, by backing the aggressive general over the famous one, by trusting that Patton's style would win the war even if Montgomery's style would win better press coverage. German generals who were captured after the war were asked which Allied commander they feared most. Almost all of them said Patton. They explained that Montgomery was predictable. You could see his preparations, anticipate his moves, prepare defenses. Patton was chaos. He appeared where you didn't expect him. He moved faster than supply lines should allow. He attacked when conventional wisdom said attack was impossible. German intelligence spent enormous resources trying to track Patton because not knowing where he was or what he was planning terrified German commanders more than any other threat. That was Patton's genius. Not that he was reckless, but that he moved so fast that enemy forces couldn't adjust. By the time Germans figured out where Patton was, he was already somewhere else attacking something they thought was safe. Montgomery never understood this. He thought war was chess, careful moves building to inevitable checkmate. Patton understood that war was poker, bluffing and aggression, and making opponents react to you instead of executing their own plans. Both approaches could work in the right circumstances. But in January 1945, facing a German army that was broken but still dangerous, Eisenhower needed the poker player, not the chess master. He needed the general who would cross rivers before engineers said bridges were ready, who would advance on roads that supply officers said couldn't support an army, who would attack in weather that other generals said made fighting impossible. He needed Patton, and he was willing to risk the political fallout to keep him. That decision won the war in Europe 4 months later. But it cost Eisenhower political capital he would need after the war. British leaders never fully trusted him again. Montgomery wrote bitter memoirs attacking Eisenhower's leadership. Churchill's History of World War II subtly criticized Americans' strategic decisions. The alliance held together long enough to defeat Germany, but it was damaged in ways that affected post-war relationships between America and Britain. All because two generals hated each other and a supreme commander had to choose between them. Thanks for watching this deep dive into one of World War II's most dramatic command crises. If you want more stories about the decisions and personalities that shaped the war, check out our video on why MacArthur was fired during the Korean War. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. These stories deserve to be told.